News First anchor and attorney Joy Lim-Nakrin joining us now from the First Alert Breaking News desk. So, Joy, what does this mean for the election interference charges that Mr. Trump is facing here in Fulton County?
So essentially now there's a whole new set of legal issues that the lower court here in Fulton County is going to have to determine, namely what acts were official acts, which of these acts was the former President Trump actually acting in his role as president, and which of those acts are actually personal acts. If Mr. Trump was acting in an official capacity as part of his role as president for any of the alleged acts, he cannot be prosecuted for those acts because the Supreme Court just ruled presidents have immunity for official acts done in office. But if Mr. Trump was acting in a personal capacity, he can be prosecuted for those acts. So this might impact, obviously, the charges against the former president here in Fulton County, certainly the legal arguments that we can anticipate seeing from both the prosecution and the defense here in Fulton County. And these are really issues that Fulton County Superior Court Judge Scott McAfee is going to have to determine with regarding what is an official act and what is a personal act.
Thank you, Joy.